So I'd like to welcome you all to our French-Canadian Roots, presented by Dr. Elizabeth Blood of the Department of World Languages and Cultures here at Salem State. My name is Mike Mitchell, and I work in the Office of Alumni Relations at the university. We're very pleased to have you with us tonight, and we're grateful to Dr. Blood for this presentation that she'll host for us this evening. And with that, I will turn the floor over to her to get started. Thank you all for joining us.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Bienvenue, as they say in French. So tonight I'm going to start just telling you a little bit about myself. So I am a professor of French. I've been at Salem State since 2003. I grew up in the state of New York, in Tarrytown, New York. My grandmother, who you see in the photo here, is the young girl on the lap of the man. That is Bernadette Plouffe. She was born in Quebec in 1898 and immigrated to, born in Quebec in 1898 and immigrated to New York State with her family when she was about 16. So those are my great-grandparents, Napoleon Plouffe and Marie Coutu. So I was always interested in French as a child because of my family heritage, but we didn't really learn French at home. Sorry, there's a little feedback there. We didn't really learn French at home. We spoke mostly English. My mother was Irish. And I learned some words, but most of my French I learned in school. I started studying in high school and then through college and my master's and my PhD program. And all of that time, we always just studied France. In all of my French courses that I took from high school through PhD, that was always about France and French literature and French culture. And I never really learned anything about Quebec, even though I knew I had relatives there. I knew my grandmother was from there. I still have cousins in Montreal who speak French, who I see occasionally. But we never learned in school anything about Quebecois history. So when I came to Salem State in 2003 was when I changed my specialization. I used to study 18th century French literature, and I started doing more work about Quebecois history and Franco-American history, so the history of those of us who are descended in the US from French-Canadian immigrants. And that has become what I've been working on over the last couple of decades. A lot of the work I've done, I have to give credit to my colleague, Elizabeth Duclos-Warcello in the Interdisciplinary Studies Department. She and I have collaborated on a lot of projects. And I've done a wide range of things. I've written a textbook on Quebecois history and culture, which is for college students. It's written in French. It's in the resource list that I'm going to be giving you. If you have some French background, that might be of interest to you. But I've also done some translations of histories of Quebecois, early Quebecois settlers, and histories of Franco-American communities in the US. We are currently, with my students, working on translations of French-Canadian folktales. We're going to translate them into English and put together a collection of French-Canadian folktales. And so this has been sort of a journey for me, an intellectual journey, but also a personal journey, because I've been learning more and more about my own family history and my own ancestors who settled in Quebec. And I started doing genealogy around 2018. My dad, when I was young, he used to always tell me that our British ancestors, so the blood side of the family, came over on the Mayflower, and our French ancestors came over with Jacques Cartier. I've discovered that that is completely not true. But we do have early 17th century settlers on both sides. And so tonight I want to show you some information about the history of Quebec and the early settlement of the French in North America. and more importantly, share with you the fascinating thing I've learned, which is that virtually all people who descend from French Canadian ancestors are cousins. We're literally all related at some point. And the reason for this, I'll show you, is because of our demographics. So if we look at the population of New France, so New France is, well, it changed borders over time, but today, basically Quebec, right? And some of the eastern provinces of Canada. So when you look at these are the population of the early settlement in New France. Before 1680, which is when 3/4 of the immigrants from France came to New France, you have under 10,000 people. So that's, you know, 1/4 of the size of the city of Salem, almost the population of Salem State University students, right? So it's not a lot of people. It's a very small population. And if you go back far enough in your ancestry, you'll probably find out that you're related to every other French Canadian descendant, because when you get back into those 1640s, 1650s, there's really only a few hundred people there. So it's, to me, super fascinating. And everyone that I have met who I've done genealogies for a bunch of friends and colleagues at Salem State, some of the other staff who are of French Canadian ancestry, I've always been able to find a common cousin. And the reason for that is because of some genealogical math. So my ancestors who were immigrants from France to New France, so the area of Quebec, are around the 7th and 8th great-grandparents generation. So if you look at how many great-grandparents you have, you see it increases exponentially. So when you get to the 7th, 8th great-grandparents, you have 1,000 8th great-grandparents, right? And if there were only 700 people or 2,500 people living in the colony at that time, you know, you're probably related to most of them. I only have one French Canadian grandparent, so my grandmother, Mimi. So I have 1/4 of this number who are in New France, but still it's a significant enough population that at some level you're going to find a connection with every other French Canadian who descended from this early group. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about those early settlers, but before that, I want to just acknowledge that I am super, super proud of my French heritage and the accomplishments of my French ancestors in settling New France. But it's important for me to recognize that their success was made possible by the First Nations, by the Indigenous people. They used their land, they settled areas that had been settled by them. They learned from them about how to survive in the climate, which was quite harsh. And so I just want to take a minute to recognize that this land that we're talking about is land that is originally inhabited by the First Nations, the Indigenous people of Quebec. You can see there are 11 First Nations that are recognized by Quebec. There are also several Métis nations. So Métis are people who are mixed French and Native American DNA. It's a specific group, mostly that from the Western Canadian provinces, although you can find Métis all over Canada. You may be thinking or may have heard in your family lore, if you're French Canadian, that you have some Indigenous blood in you. There have been some estimates that, you know, over 50% of French Canadian people have some kind of Indigenous blood. most researchers think that those numbers are way overblown, and that if people do have an Indigenous ancestor, it's usually just one ancestor at the 7th or 8th grandparent level. So maybe 1% of your DNA. I was really excited when I did my DNA test, thinking that I was going to find Indigenous blood, but nothing. I'm 100% European. So I think it's a story that a lot of, as in the US, there are a lot of people who want to sort of claim that Indigenous ancestry because they feel so connected to the land. But it's probably not the case, or not as widespread as you think it might be. So moving on, we're going to start with this person, Jacques Cartier. So Jacques Cartier was one of the first French explorers to come to the area that is today Quebec. You can see on the little map there, he took several trips over to scout out the land, planted a flag and claimed the land for France. He also had some exchanges with Indigenous people in various parts of Gaspé and Quebec City, which was then Stadacona. He was not actually the first European to come to this part of the world, nor the first Frenchman to come to this part of the world. There was, for many decades, fishermen who came from France to fish off the coast of Quebec and Nova Scotia. And so they had been coming for quite some time, had been on the land, had met some of the Native American people. And you see also in the lower picture there some fur trading. That was one of the first big economic ventures for the French in this new France world, was to engage in fur trading with the Indigenous people. And you may not know, but the word Quebec is an Iroquois word that means where the river narrows. So you can see the St. Lawrence River starts out quite wide by the Gaspé Peninsula and starts to narrow right around Quebec City. So I know my father was lying when he said we came with Jacques Cartier, because Jacques Cartier never settled in New France. He was an explorer. He came on several trips, but there was no settlement that early. One of the earliest settlements that we have is in 1604 in Acadie, so Acadia, which is today Nova Scotia, mostly around the areas of Port Royal and Grand Pre. And that was a very small settlement. And this picture is actually a picture drawn by Samuel de Champlain of the settlement in Acadie in 1604. And Samuel de Champlain created the first true settlement in New France in Quebec. So on the village where the village of Stadacona was, he built this little fort. It's called the Habitation. And it was built for Champlain and the other people from France that he brought over with him to try to start settling the colony. Most of the people at that time were men. So you had fur traders, fishermen, soldiers, missionaries, and a very small number of families who came over early on. And very slowly in the 17th century, we see more and more people emigrating to New France from France. You may be wondering where they came from in France, and you see on the map here, the areas in blue are the main areas that people came from. So a lot from Normandy and Brittany. Ile-de-France is where Paris is located, right? And along the Touraine and Anjou and Poitou. So this whole northwestern area of France is where most people come, not all, but most people who came to New France came from those areas. this is a statue in Saint-Malo in Brittany to a French privateer heading off for adventures in the New World. And you see the Quebec flags there, and he's pointing out off across the ocean. So we have slow start to the emigration, but I want to talk about a few people who are really famous in Quebecois history as early settlers. And the two most famous are Louis Ebert and Marie Rollet. So Louis Ebert and Marie Rollet, his wife, came early to New France and were the first habitants. So they came in 1617. And instead of just living in Samuel de Champlain's habitation, they decided they wanted to farm the land. They had actually spent some time stopped earlier in the settlement in Acadie, and then came on to Quebec. So you see here, they're quite famous. There are statues in Quebec City to Louis Hebert and Marie Rollet and their children. There are paintings and there are songs written about them. So they're quite a famous couple, and many people can trace their roots to this couple because they are one of the earliest couples, and like other French Canadians, had a lot of children. Another famous person is Elen de Port. So Elen de Port is the first French child born in North America. She was born in 1620. She lived in Samuel de Champlain's habitation. You see a picture of her signature there. She learned to read and write. She also, for many years, worked as a midwife. So she's on a lot of the documents that you might find about your ancestors, listing their birth or their baptism. She was often godmother and assisted at the births of many of the children in those early years when you really only had, a couple hundred people living in Quebec, in the area of Quebec City. There's a great book about her called Elen's World, which I actually just finished reading. It's a really well-researched book and follows her life from her birth in Samuel de Champlain's habitation through her 2 marriages and her 15 children that she had to help populate this new colony. My daughter is actually, I have a daughter who's adopted, and she has, her birth family has deep roots in Louisiana, and through her Louisiana ancestors, I've been able to trace her lineage actually back to Elen de Port. So her family, so far, the earliest I've found are 60 people who came in the 1630s, but my daughter's ancestor was Elen de Port, who was born there in 1620, which is kind of amazing. So some of the early settlers of Quebec, there's a great plaque that you can find on this website. It's the PRDH is a research organization in Quebec that does work on the early settlers of Quebec. So they have a listing of all of these names. I couldn't fit the whole thing on one screen, so I just chose the top part. But if you are doing your ancestry and looking for your early 17th century French Canadian ancestors, you very likely will find someone on this list that you're related to. I am related to Jean Bourdon, and Jacqueline Potel. So they came in 1635. And interestingly enough, on a personal note, so my daughter's ancestor, Elen de Port, was very good friends with Jean Bourdon. They lived next door to each other, and they were close. Their families were close friends for their entire lives in Quebec, which is kind of neat. So we have these early settlers who you may find in your family trees. We also have the super couples. So the super couples, researchers have found that most French Canadians, or not most, but many French Canadian descendants can trace their ancestry to these four couples, or five couples, sorry, these five couples who were married early in the 17th century in Quebec City and had many, many children, and therefore many, many descendants, because their children had many children. This was not by chance. It was a strategy that they used to increase the population in Quebec, right? So people were rewarded for having many children. If you had 10 children, you got a pension from the government for the rest of your life. If you didn't produce enough children, you sometimes had penalties, or you weren't given a fishing license or something like that, right? So there were definitely government policies that promoted a large number of births. But we see these couples, so Noël Langlois and Françoise Grenier, who married in 1634. By 1800, they had 7,166 descendants, including, I'm going to drop some names here. There are a lot of Americans who have French Canadian ancestries who are famous. So one of them is Madonna. Madonna, the singer, can trace her ancestry to Noël Langlois and Françoise Grenier. There's also Jehan Guillon et Matrine Robin. They were married in 1615, and you can see they produced almost 10,000 descendants by 1800. Some of their descendants include Celine Dion, the famous singer. We have Zachary Cloutier and Zant Dupont, over 10,000 descendants by 1800. Justin Bieber and Angelina Jolie are related to them. And Jacques Archambault and Françoise Toureau married in 1629, and Marin Boucher and Perrine Mallet married in 1629 also. So together, these five couples have produced many, many ancestors. Ryan Gosling actually is related to Marin Boucher. So if you can trace your ancestry to one of these super couples, you can also find your connection to Madonna and Justin Bieber and Celine Dion, which is just kind of mind-blowing, I think. Another place that many people can trace their ancestry to is the Ile d'Orléans. The Ile d'Orléans is a small island just up the coast from Quebec City. So this is a photo I took from the upper town of Quebec, looking up the river. And you can see the island here in the distance. So if you drive up the coast, it's about a half an hour drive. There's one bridge that crosses over onto the island. And this island is famous because it was home to many of the early settlers. There was very fertile land. People were able to farm it easily. This is a map of the island. So the way that things worked in the 17th century was a system called a seigneurie. So there was a seigneur or a lord who was granted land. So usually it would be someone who was an aristocrat. Sometimes it was a religious group. Sometimes a very prominent, maybe merchant, or there were a couple of companies that were set up to recruit people to come to New France from France. So those people would be given big tracts of land. And then the seigneur's responsibility was to recruit settlers to come and clear the land and work the land and plant and have an agricultural economy. So their land would be divided up into small little strips, and you see the strips here. So the rivers all around this island, right? The island's just maybe 10 miles from one end to the other. You can drive around it easily in a half a day. And the strips were divided like this so that each farmer would have some interior land to farm, but also a little bit of coast so they could have access to the waterway to transport their goods back and forth to other parts of New France. You can't really see it on here because it's pretty small, but there is a map out there where you can identify exactly which plot of land belonged to your ancestors. There's a great genealogical center on the Ile d'Orléans called the Maison de Nozaire, so the home of our ancestors. You see the plaque there. This is outside the Maison de Nozaire. It's a great little center if you ever visit the Ile d'Orléans. They're very welcoming. They'll help you identify who your ancestors were, your early ancestors, and where they lived on the island. A lot of those little plots of land also have plaques on them now. So if you're driving around that one loop that goes around the island, you can see a little plaque of this is the land that where your ancestors lived. That's a picture of me in front of a 17th century house we went to, which is now a winery. We went in to do some wine tasting. The Ile d'Orléans is fabulous for wine tasting and cider tasting and all kinds of gastronomical adventures. And we went to this place, and the wine tasting was in the back, in the basement of the building. And I remember thinking, wow, this, such an old building, and I wonder who lived here. And I came around the front and read the plaque that's on there, and they were my ancestors, Thomas Rondeau and André Remondière. I couldn't believe it. So that was a really exciting find, and it's great if you're able to go and visit there and find the actual land and walk on the land where your ancestors lived. So even though we have a lot of people moving to New France and we have this whole system, seigneurie system set up to recruit farmers to come, there was still a population problem in New France. In 1660, there were only 2,500 people, as opposed to the British colonies down here in New England, where there were at that time about 75,000 people. So in the 1666 census, the men outnumbered women 2-1. That's the Quebec census, the New France census. There had been a wave of young women who came. So we had more men coming, obviously, for the fur trade and farming and trapping and hunting and fishing and soldiers, but we didn't have enough women coming. There were 262 filles à marier, so they were single marriageable girls who immigrated on their own, of their own volition, from France to New France in search of a better life, in search of a husband, and being able to set up a home and a farm, which maybe were not things that were easily available to every young woman in France at that time. And so you see on the right there, if you are descended from one of these filles à marier, you can get a certificate and a pin to show that you're part of that early group of pioneer women who came over to help populate the land. But even with them, it was not enough. So we have still only a couple thousand people. France decided that they wanted to really invest in populating New France around this time. So the King of France, who was then Louis XIV, set up a program to fund young women to move to New France and marry within New France. These young women were called the filles du roi, the daughters of the king. They were not literally the daughters of the king. They were just young women who were marriageable, right? So single or widowed, some young widows who volunteered to come. But in this case, they were given a dowry by the King of France. So the king would pay their dowry, would pay their passage over on the boat, would give them, each young woman received like a chest with everything that she would need to start her new life. So clothing material, sewing, needles, kitchen utensils and pots, right? So anything that she was going to need to start her new life. The fun thing about this is when you're doing genealogical research, usually when I'm doing ancestral research, I'm looking through the male lines, right? Because that's where the name is carried. But when you're doing Quebecois research, it's fun because you're thinking, oh, who was this person's mother, and were they one of the Fidua? There's a list of the Fidua that you can find. It's in the resources that I'm giving you. And it's kind of like a hunt to find, if you find someone who immigrated during this 10-year period, 1663 to 1673, who came on her own, she's most likely going to be on that list of Fidua. Because other young women would come with their families or with a husband. Most of these young women were married within a year, some within a few weeks, a number of them actually. And the other great thing is that they got to choose their husbands, which would not have happened had they stayed in France at this time. In the 17th century, your parents would have decided for you who was a good match and who you would be married off to. The Fidua who came with the dowry from the king were able to choose their own husbands. So the husbands who were the most industrious and hardworking, the best looking, the ones who had already set up a homestead would be seen as more desirable candidates. And so that's kind of a fun fact about those early Fidua. This program was a huge success. In 1671, for example, over 300 babies were born in 1 year. By 1700, we see the population in New France at 15,000. By 1750, there were 55,000. And so today, millions of Canadians and Americans of French Canadian descent can trace their ancestry to at least one of these Fidua. I, as I mentioned, only have one French Canadian grandparent, and I've already found 9 or 10 of them in my family tree. Actually, there's one of them, Marguerite Laplace, who is my 8th great grandmother 3 times over in 3 different ways, because everybody was intermarrying down the line. But like with the Fille Mariée, you can get a certificate saying that you are descended from one of the filles du roi, and a little pin to show that you are among one of those early settler founding families. The filles du roi have taken on a kind of mythic image in French Canadian culture, and it's almost like you're one of the Mayflower families, right? If for British ancestors, right? Yeah, like your ancestors came over on the Mayflower. If you're British, if you're French Canadian, your ancestors were the filles du roi. So moving along here, oops. Around the same time that the filles du roi came, we also had a group of soldiers sent by Louis XIV. After repeated calls from people in the colony that they needed more protection, the Régiment de Carignan Salière was sent to Quebec. This was a short-term gig for most of these soldiers. They were sent over for a period of a few years. And they came around the same time as the filles du roi. So many of them, after their contract was up, decided to stay on. Many of them married filles du roi. So often when you're doing your research, you can find an ancestor who was one of the Carignan soldiers who married one of the filles du roi. And there's a full list of those soldiers on this website, fidua.org, which is also in the resource list. Meanwhile, in Acadia, so we mentioned there was another settlement up in the area of Nova Scotia, Port Royal. In the 1671 census, we also see a very small population of people there. Just 400 people living in Acadia, 200 in Port Royal. But by 1750, about 10,000. And you can see, although Acadians and Quebecois French people all came from France. They're really considered by scholars, at least they're considered two distinct populations because they grew and flourished in different parts of Canada, and their histories are a little bit different. So in Quebec, we see this small group of people who basically stayed still, right? We have this small number of people, they're marrying, they're having lots of babies, the population is growing, and they're all sort of staying in that area. Of course, Quebec expanded westward to Montreal was the next big city. But in Acadia, we have the same thing happening. We have a small group of people. They are also intermarrying, they're building a community, they're farming the land. And we see their population growing. So you may be, when you're doing your research on your ancestors, you may come along some Acadian families. Here's a list of some very common names that are particular to Acadia. In particular, you might find LeBlanc, Landry, Thériault, Thibodeau, Dupont, Dugas. All of these are Blanchard, right? All of these are names that are really particular to Acadia, as opposed to Quebec, the Quebec settlement. So we have the population growing. We have the territory growing. This map of New France, circa 1750, you see extends from Nova Scotia, Quebec, through the Great Lakes, through down the Mississippi Valley to Louisiana. And so you did have some movement of people from Quebec westward and south down through Louisiana. You also had other French immigrants coming into Louisiana through New Orleans, right, from the south. And you see on this map, the territories over here in Nova Scotia and Port Royal were ceded to Great Britain in 1713, but the colonies still continued to grow after that. Until everything changed. So 1755, we have the Grand Dérangement. This is the Great Deportation of Acadians. You can see on the map here, the French population during this time, the British told them they had to either swear allegiance to the British crown or leave their lands. And so many people were deported if they wouldn't swear allegiance to the British crown. You see some of them left to come to the United States. Some of them went to other parts of Quebec. Some went back to Europe. You don't see them coming in directly to Louisiana, but many people made their way to Louisiana, which was still a French territory. And those people are today the Cajuns, right? The Acadiens in French. If you say the word Acadien, so Acadian, Acadien, 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 Cajun, right? So the Cajun, the Cajuns, the word Cajun is actually the word Acadian, just pronounced differently, right? So a lot of the Acadians came to Louisiana, settled in the countryside. A lot of them eventually made their way back to Quebec and to Nova Scotia. And you might find that in your ancestry. I have a friend, Kathy Neville, who I was working on her research with her. And I was looking to see like, oh, maybe you have some Fidua, or maybe you have settlers on the Ile d'Orleans. We were probably cousins, but all of her ancestors came from Acadia, and many of them traveled all over the place and ended up back later on, many years later, in Nova Scotia. Around this time in 1759, we also have the battle on the Plains of Abraham. So that is Quebec City. If you've been to Quebec City, the Plains of Abraham is a beautiful park in the upper town. Quebec is up on a cliff if you've never been there, so that you have the upper town and the lower town. The Plains of Abraham. Abraham was Abraham Martin. Some people think it's a religious reference, but it's not. Abraham Martin was Elen de Port's uncle, and he owned this land. Those were his fields. And what happened was the British had been menacing the French for many years. And on this day in 1759, they pretended to be passing by Quebec City. But instead of continuing on down the river, they at night pulled up on the side of the cliff. They scampered up the side of the cliff and surprised the French troops on the Plains of Abraham. The battle lasted, some people argue about the length of time, 15 minutes to maybe a half an hour. France was defeated, and New France became a possession of England. And so that's really the end. It took a few years, but that's really the end of French immigration to New France, which is another reason why we have the population that we have today, where so many people can trace their ancestors to these common, this common group of people who were the early settlers in the 17th century. So you see a map here, 1791. France has lost most of its possessions in the New World. So Bas Canada is Lower Canada, Upper Canada. So Lower Canada would become the province of Quebec. Upper Canada is Ontario. And we have the United States down here by 1791 had already rebelled against the British. And so where are they now? There are over 20 million descendants of these early French settlers in North America. Half of those people live in the United States. So 10 million are in Canada, in Quebec and the other provinces spread out across Canada, and half of them are in the United States. There are 2 million New Englanders who identify as Franco-American, that is descendants of French-Canadian immigrants. They're 11.5% of the New England population. This makes Franco-Americans the third largest group of European descended immigrants after the Irish and the Italians. Why is it that everyone knows TV shows and movies about Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants, but no one knows about Franco-American immigrants? That's one of the questions I try to answer in my research. When you Google Franco-American, this is usually the first image that comes up, is Franco-American spaghetti and meatballs. Why does this happen? I don't have time to tell you tonight, but I would be happy to come back another time and tell you about the saga of Franco-Americans and why no one knows who Franco-Americans are. I just want to end with the June 24th is Saint Jean Baptiste Day. Saint John the Baptist was the patron saint of the early settlers of Quebec. So this was celebrated June 24th as a religious holiday in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in Quebec. Today, it has been morphed into the Quebecois national holiday. So it's now a non-religious national holiday in Quebec, where everyone sings this national anthem written by Gilles Vigneault. Gilles Vigneault is still alive. He wrote this in the 1970s. And unlike other national anthems, this one is all about love. So the refrain is, people of the country, it's your turn to let yourselves talk about love. And June 24th, increasingly in the United States, is becoming recognized as Franco-American Flag Day. There are going to be some Franco-American events happening, notably in Lowell, Massachusetts. There's a Flag Day celebration in Hartford, Connecticut, and I believe in Nashua, New Hampshire. And I think they're starting one this year in Fall River, Massachusetts. So it's become now a day of pride for descendants of the French Canadian settlers in addition to those who live in Quebec. So I don't know if any of you are doing genealogy, if you're just starting, or if you've already done a lot of genealogy. I just wanted to give you a few tips. So use a good search platform like ancestry.com. It's not infallible. You can sometimes find incorrect information in other people's family trees. So you need to be wary of that. But look for official documents. I have found in my research that once you get far enough back in your tree that you're across the border into Canada, that people in French Canada have been obsessive about documenting their family trees for many years, long before Americans started obsessing about it. So you can find in a lot of other people's family trees, you can find some really good information. Even if you don't have the international ancestry subscription, you can still find, people will copy and post birth records, death records, marriage records. You can also find reputable records from several of those sources that I have in the resource list, the PRDH, which has records for each of the early settlers, who they married, where they came from, who their descendants were. And those are pretty reputable. You should be aware of something called deep names. This always messes people up when they start doing ancestral research. These are two of my ancestors. So one is Jean Fafard dit La Framboise, and the other is Guillaume Boucher dit Morancy. So dit just means called, so it's kind of a nickname. So his name was Jean Fafard, but they called him the raspberry, right? Or Guillaume Boucher, they called him Morancy. And so these, when you're doing research, sometimes the descendants of these people will take the name Fafard, but sometimes they'll take the name La Framboise or Framboise. And also spellings can vary a lot in those early records. So sometimes it's hard to figure out, who exactly is who. Also, there's a long period of time where every male child was named Joseph something, and every female child was named Marie something. So you often come across Marie with the same last name that could be somebody completely different than the person you're looking for. If you need assistance, I highly recommend the American French Genealogical Society. They're a great resource for people who are doing genealogy on their French Canadian ancestors. There's also a great little center in Tolland, Connecticut, the Genealogical Society, French Canadian Genealogical Society of Connecticut. They have a little center. They're so kind and welcoming, and they have all of the resources there. They can look through their books with you and help you figure out where your ancestors came from. There's also on the list that I'm giving out a bunch of podcasts and blogs and Facebook groups that you can join, where there are other people who are doing research, learning about their ancestors. They're in the Facebook groups, particularly people who will help translate a document for you if you come across something that you're not sure exactly what it means, or if it's handwritten, as a lot of those old 17th century documents are, and it's hard to read. There are people who are more familiar with it who can help you to figure out what it's saying. In terms of podcasts, I strongly recommend Maple Stars and Stripes. It's a genealogy podcast by Sandra Goodwin. She lives out in central Massachusetts, and she has all of her back podcasts on her website. And so you can access them anytime and listen to interviews and people giving tips about research and cultural history kind of presentations as well. And I recommend that you visit Quebec and or Nova Scotia. That's next on my list. And you can find out more by just being there. This is a picture of the lower town of Quebec. With the Notre Dame Chapel, which is one of the oldest stone churches in North America. And if you go to this square in the lower town of Quebec, the outline of Samuel de Champlain's Habitation is marked on those stones. So you can see exactly where the habitation actually stood. So that's all I have for you. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to also connect with you if you want to connect with me by email or Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm always here to answer questions. Does anyone have a question? I would invite you to unmute and just tell me. Has anyone been doing ancestral research?
Yes, I've done quite a bit through my mother. She left a huge amount of genealogy, and we do trace ourselves back to 1666 at L'Île d'Orléans at Saint-Famille. And I've been up there many times. I'm overdue because the country's been shut down here for a couple of years, but I miss Canada.
Yeah, I know, me too. I usually go in the summers and wasn't able to go last summer or this summer. So
early August when they have the raspberries, heavy cream, and maple sugar. I get a bowl of that every time. I love the island. Love the island. I think it's the most beautiful place in the world.
It is really beautiful.
I've been to 16 countries, but we're a descendant of a field de role. Anne Rivette married Rene Willette, who was my ancestor 13 generations ago.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so I've got a lot of information. Your presentation was very good, by the way. I've been studying this for 40 years.
I saw you nodding, so I was like, okay, I'm
not doing good.
What's your name?
Richard Willette.
Richard Willette. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know Lucille Willette?
No.
Okay.
But we're probably related.
You're probably related.
I'm more related to the Willettes who spell it Ouellet. But I spelled the name the long way. There's a lot of variations on the name Willette.
Yes. A lot of names are, especially once they came to the US, the spelling might have changed. Like Tim Tebow, the football player, Tebow is originally a Thibault, Thibault, but nobody could spell it, so they just phonetic.
Tatro was another name, had a lot of different spellings. Tatro. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will be sending you the research that we've made on my family. There was a letter written by a great aunt that is really interesting, that depicts their living situation in Canada in the late 1800s.
Wow.
And they talk about harvesting grass along the St. Lawrence River to use as insulation in their home.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, the house I went to, the stone walls were so thick. It's like, I guess you have to keep the cold out somehow.
Yeah, my favorite restaurant was in Saint-Famille. It was called Latre, which means the hearth, but they went out of business last time I was up there. But that was near my ancestral land.
Wow.
And since then, I found out exactly where our land was on Saint-Famille, and I've been dying to go back to see it. It's a trout farm now.
It's so fun. It's like a detective game.
Yeah.
Frankie, Laura, I see your hand.
Oh, yeah, I'm Elizabeth LeBrun. That's the name of, I don't know, that was our cats, and it just.
Oh, Elizabeth, I didn't recognize you.
That's who I am, yeah. Right. So, so I had my father's parents are both French Canadian, and so I had the name LeBrun. Somebody did the genealogy for me. I tried it myself on Ancestry, and I couldn't get anywhere with it. And the reason for that is that it had changed. It was Brun and Bryn and Brun and Bryn, and it sort of went like that. And So the original person who came here was Francois Brun, and it was like 1630, something like that. But I saw tonight on the founding families of Arcadia, I saw a Brun. So that may have been him.
Could have
or
been. And some of the Acadians, when they left, came to Quebec, right? So that you could have ancestors who were in early Quebec who also were in Acadia.
Also, right. And he came from Poitou.
Right.
Yeah.
A common departure site.
Yeah. But I haven't done the female side because my mère was a Demers. So, you know, that would be interesting to try to trace that back. And I think there is a Boucher in there somewhere. So I noticed one of those original, you know, families was a Boucher. There's a Boucher there. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Let me know if I can be of help.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question or? Let's see, one of my students had to leave, former students. So looking at ancestors in Nova Scotia. Oh, can't hear you, Mike.
Sorry, I always forget my microphone has its own on-off switch, so I just started talking and realized it's not turned on. If it's okay with you, can we make your PowerPoint available to folks after the presentation is over as well?
Sure.
Great. So for those folks, we did make you know, fortunately everybody got the email. We did make a last minute change of plans to do this on Zoom instead of our original webinar platform. You will get an email after the event is over with a link to some additional resources that Professor Blood has provided. Her presentation being one, and then a separate 2-page document, just including even more resources on research and genealogy and things like that. So you'll also have an opportunity to rate the program. It's a simple 1 to 10 scale. We hope you'll take a moment and do that. And we're always open to hearing more suggestions on other programs that we'd like to offer. So if you have any, we'd love to hear them. And if Professor Blood is willing, we'd love to have her back for another presentation in the future.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you all so much for coming.
And this will also, the email will also include a link to this recording as well. So in case there was anything you wanted to go back and reference to hear any supplemental points, the recording will be available to you as well.
Thank you.
All right.
Merci
Thank
bien.
you.
Derrière.
Mhm.
Much,
I want
everyone.
to introduce you to Max. That's my oldest son that I was telling you
Hi.
on the research on
Hi,
our family.
Max.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So what have you found in your family?
I traced one side back to Beauport. It's like just outside of Quebec, and a bunch of like other names. There's a lot of people change their names around in like the orders of first and middle. So that was tough for a little while figuring that out.
Yeah, it is kind of hard sometimes because you're like, is this the same person or is this somebody else with a very similar name?
And
But
we have a name that's not necessarily stuck to family tradition, right? It's more of a nickname.
Yeah.
So that's made it that much harder for anyone in our family to kind of continue to figure out and where they've come from and where they've gone. So he's gotten stuck a few times.
but Beauport is beautiful. It's right across, right as you're going up the coast from Quebec towards the Ile d'Orléans.
First town.
Mhm.
It is- We hope someday to go see it if we can, but we just have such a muddled family. It's been so hard for us to trace, not muddled, but because of the name changing. It's a little bit easier. My mother and father both are French Canadian, so it's a little bit easier on the Banville side than it is on the Bibo side for the nickname factor. But
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I introduced. I know I've spoken to you about how he's tried to chase us back as best
Yeah.
he could.
I mean, and sometimes it's like a lifelong adventure. I mean, I still have many branches that I haven't fleshed out yet. It just takes a long time. And sometimes I get really into it and I'll spend days just doing that. And then I'm like, oh, I have a research paper I need to be writing.
And it is so interesting to understand your culture too. We found that most of the females in our family did not have birth certificates, and that was a part of their kind of the culture of which they brought here. And then the women also went back to Canada to have their babies up until actually, I think my grandfather's generation, they were still going up to Canada to have their babies and then to come down. So the documentation is all very muddled for us.
Yeah, very weird. So my grandmother, married an English Anglo-American, so she stayed in New York, but she would go every summer and spend the summer in Quebec at the old family farm in Saint Felix de Valois. So I can imagine if people were having children, they would maybe sometimes the children were born when they were back in Canada.
That was their tradition, I guess, to send the women back.
And a lot of people went back for schooling also. I know a lot of Franco-American families would send their children back to go to college in Quebec.
It's wonderful. Thank you. This was just fantastic.
Thank you.
I've been dying to hear you speak, so thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, thanks everyone. And hopefully we can meet again
Yeah.
and talk about
Person
Franco-Americans.
the next time, who knows?
All
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Yeah.
right.
Before